Welcome to the second video showing you how to write a wonderful A-level Unit 2 Section B essay. This video is going to focus on how to write a good introduction, because in the last video you were taught how to plan a decent essay. At this stage you probably got your plan ready and you're ready to start writing. All of your ideas are on the page. We just need to make sure that those notes get transformed into a wonderful, cogent argument of an essay. What I am going to show you today then is how to plan and write an effective introduction. And what I'm looking for is that all of you understand the requirements, so you all understand what would make a good introduction. I'd like you all to understand how to write that introduction in an effective manner. And I'd like you to understand how to avoid the common mistakes that I see all of the time and that those examiners won't really want to see. Because after all, there's a good introduction and there's a terrible introduction. By showing you some terrible ones, you'll be able to see what you need to make sure you're not emulating. When it comes to writing a really effective introduction, I think there are three things that you need to make sure you show. First of all, you need to show that you have clearly engaged with the essay title. Too frequently do I see students who write an essay but haven't quite hit the actual expectations of the essay. For example, if your essay is supposed to be about love and the disappointment that comes with it, and you purely write about relationships, then you've not quite hit all parts of that question. So when you're writing your essay, you need to make sure you are fulfilling exactly what that question has asked you to do. Secondly, I think a good introduction has a very clear thesis. At the start of your essay, you should be able to show the examiner your opinion or your thought or the way you're going to argue your points. I don't like students who see essays just as ways of explaining everything you know about something or dumping out a lot of information or a lot of knowledge onto a page. It's not a regurgitation of fact. It's not simply a way of showing off everything you know. A good student will show that they've engaged with the question, engaged with the poetry, and then show me what they're going to argue. I'd like you to step away from essays being a mind dump and instead seeing essays as a way of arguing points, as a way of having a point to argue and then showing through your writing the way you got to that conclusion and what your thoughts and feelings are along the way. I'll be able to show you really good examples of thesis statements later on in this video. Finally, a really good introduction should show understanding of the poems central to your argument while signposting at the start of an essay. Too frequently do I see students who say things like, in this essay I'm going to talk about this poem, this poem, this poem and this poem. Not really showing that they've understood those poems from the very start, simply that they know those are the poems that they're going to use. Whilst we do signpost at the start of our essay, I think it's useful to show a little bit of understanding and engagement with those poems before you start your main analysis. It would differentiate you from someone who hasn't quite understood what they want to say yet, and they'll find out along the way. I always think you should know what you're going to write at the start of the essay, not wait until halfway through the essay before you figure it out. Now, this is not an exhausting list. I've just boiled it down to three main ideas that I'd like to engage with you today. Now, if there are three things that make a good essay introduction, there are probably three things that make a less effective introduction. And these are the things that I'd like to point out for you. I see lots of students who parrot the essay title with very little engagement. For example, if the question is, write about how Duffy and Larkin talk about relationships, then the first start of your essay is, Larkin and Duffy write lots of poems about relationships. All you've actually done is just parroted the essay title. It shows no engagement, it shows no understanding. All it does is show that you've understood what the question is and you've just parroted it. I think there are much more effective ways of doing that. From your title, I have no more information than I had from the essay question. What I'd like you to do is to start your essay with that thesis statement to show that you've engaged with the question and you've got an idea of where your essay is going to go. A lot of students will allude to poems but doesn't show understanding. So a lot of students will say, in this essay I'm going to talk about this poem, this poem, this poem and this poem. That doesn't show any understanding at all. And I'll show you some examples of where that is done, and you can see why it's a bit weaker. And then finally, some students show no direction to their essay. They don't have a central argument, they don't have a way of propelling themselves throughout the essay. I'd like you, from the very start of your essay, to show that you know where your essay is going to go because you've already thought about these ideas. Lots of students don't plan their essays, and therefore from the start of the essay, I don't quite know where they're going with it because they don't either. This is the essay title that we're going to have a look at for today's video. I've deliberately kept this different to the one I made in the last video because I didn't want to do all of the planning and all of the introduction for you. So this is just a way of showing that these skills are transferable across any essay title, not just confined to one. So the question we have a look at today is compare how the two poets write about love in their anthologies. You must analyse in detail at least 2 poems from each of your set texts. I feel this is a fairly simple essay when it comes to these 2 poets. This is the one that we're going to use for today. I think the best way to really highlight what makes a good essay and what makes a terrible introduction to an essay is by showing you some examples. So this is the first example I'd like to show to you, and it'll look quite familiar to many of you because at GCSE level this is the type of thing that people wrote, and it was entirely appropriate. It does exactly what it says on the tin, it introduces their essay. However, I don't think this introduction introduces an argument, and that's going to be probably the difference between AS level and GCSE. You need to have a direction in your essay opening. So this is the introduction. In this essay, I will analyse how Caroline Duffy and Philip Larkin talk about love. I will focus on Valentine and Havisham from Meantime, and Love Songs in Age and An Arundel Tomb from The Wits and Weddings. Now what this introduction does is it tells the examiner what you are about to do. And I think that's a little simplistic. So to highlight a few of the issues with this introduction, I'd like to first of all talk about this. There is no reason for you to say in this essay. You don't have to tell the examiner what you're doing because they already know what you're doing. They're the person who has set you this task. That would be like starting a letter with, I am writing this letter. I know you're writing a letter because I am reading said letter. So there's no need to start your introduction by saying in this essay I am going to. That's very simplistic. Instead, I'd rather see you engaging with the question title. The second thing I'd point out is you don't need to use the first person personal pronoun I. When it comes to academia, and when it particularly comes to a university study, university tutors will not like seeing the word I in the introduction of an essay. They don't even like to see it all the way through an essay. Now at A-level study, it's entirely appropriate to give your thoughts and your feelings. At university, they will probably be suggesting that you haven't done enough study to have a valid opinion yet. What you need to do is use your essay as your thoughts and your feelings. Use the essay as your argument. So my advice to you is to avoid using that first person personal pronoun. Okay, the same goes for we will be talking about or this makes us feel. I think it's much stronger to use the third person. So the reader may feel, or a critic might suggest. Okay, or this may affect the reader. So I would avoid the first person personal pronoun. The next thing I'd mention is this first sentence I think is fairly weak. In this essay, I will analyse how Caroline Duffy and Philip Larkin talk about love. I think that's particularly weak because first of all, Caroline Duffy and Philip Larkin don't talk about love. They write about love, but that's a little bit of a pedantic point from me. The real issue with that statement is because that's just parroting exactly what the exam question asked us. The exam question said, hey, tell us about Philip Larkin and Caroline Duffy and the way they write about love. Just parroting the question back to the examiner is a little bit basic. This doesn't show any engagement with the theme of love at all. This doesn't suggest how Larkin and Duffy write about love, it just simply states that they do write about love, which we already know. It would be much stronger to show that you understand how they write about love. Okay, so a little bit of a weak opening for me. The next part where it says, I will focus on Valentine and Havisham from Meantime and Love Songs in Age and An Arundel Tomb from The Wits and Weddings. This is signposting the argument, okay, so I can see in this essay, yes, you're going to cover Valentine and Havisham and Love Songs in Age and An Arundel Tomb. However, from this introduction, I have no idea whether or not you have read these poems at all. There's no engagement with what these poems seem to be suggesting, or how they're similar, or how they're different. There's no simple introduction to these poems showing how they reveal certain aspects of love. It just simply states that these are going to be the ones that we come across in the essay. Now, I think it's a really good idea to signpost which poems you're going to talk about, but I'd like it to be peppered with a little bit of understanding about each one before you start your deep analysis as you move through. So I think a fairly weak introduction. It does exactly what it says on the tin. It's very simple. It tells me what you're going to talk about, but it doesn't really engage with the question, and it doesn't really engage with the poems that are going to feature in this essay. So this is the type of introduction I think we should try and avoid. If we take a look at this second introduction, you will see that there are clearly some more strengths in this piece of writing than the previous one. Both Duffy and Larkin focus on how love can lead to disappointment. This is most clearly seen in Duffy's Havisham, where we see a female persona who has been treated badly by love. In Valentine, Duffy shows us we should be careful about love and commitment because it can be painful. These are similar to Larkin's An Arundel Tomb, a poem about how love is a construct humans are determined to find, and Love Songs in Age, a poem about a widow who feels she has been let down by an ideal love. I think this introduction shows far more strength from the very start of the essay, because from the introduction I can see that this student understands how love is presented in these poems, and also how these poems seem to interact with each other. So from the very start, this student has used the word both. And that already, as an examiner, would make me think this student is the type of student who can see links and connections between the poetry that they've studied. And that would get my thoughts being processed as to AO4. I am probably going to be awarding AO4 in this essay because this student can make connections between these poems. Both Duffy and Larkin focus on how love can lead to disappointment. I think that is a fairly clear statement about these poems. This student doesn't just realise that love is spoken about, this student realises that the central argument is that love can lead to disappointment. That sounds like a thesis to me. That sounds like an argument. So in this essay, this student is probably going to explore the idea of how love can lead to disappointment. The previous student just said these poems are about love. This student says that these two writers write about how love and disappointment go hand in hand. This essay has a direction, the previous essay did not. This is most clearly seen in Duffy's Havisham, where we see a female persona who has been treated badly by love. So this student is able to not just introduce the first poem that they're going to talk about, but they've also shown how this poem works. So when I'm constantly in class asking you, what is this poem really about, or what does this poem really show us, this student has been able to, in a fairly simple statement, has been able to show that this poem works because of this, or this poem makes this point by doing this. So this student is probably picking up some AO1 marks, or at least signposting their AO1 marks by showing that they're able to use the technical vocabulary of female persona. And they're also being able to signpost what their argument is going to be throughout this essay. They then introduce their second poem. In Valentine, Duffy shows us we should be careful about love and commitment because it can be painful. Again, that's fairly clear. This student clearly understands Valentine and they understand Havisham before they start writing the essay, whereas I had no real signposting of that information in the previous essay. They have used the word we, they've used it twice there. I don't like that. I think it'd be far stronger to show, to say if it was Duffy shows the reader that they should be careful. I think that would be far stronger, but that's just a minor point here. I do think this essay is a little bit stronger than the one before. What they then do is they continue to signpost the rest of their argument. So these are similar to Larkin's An Arundel Tomb, a poem about how love is a construct humans are determined to find, and Love Songs in Age, a poem about a widow who feels she's been let down by an ideal love. What this student has been able to do is introduce the poems, very briefly. They haven't gone into lots of detail here, but they've been able to not just introduce the poems, but introduce them with a little bit of understanding, so that as a reader, I can see how these poems all seem to fit together. They've also used that term, these are similar. And again, that is prepping me to give AO 4 marks in this essay. So whilst this introduction is not perfect, whilst it could be much stronger, it's definitely stronger than the previous introduction. The student who wrote Introduction 1 is the type of student who didn't really know what they were going to put in their essay until they'd actually started writing. That's why that in their introduction they only state the poems that they're going to talk about. They're kind of hoping that later on in the essay they're going to be able to work themselves towards a conclusion. Whereas the student who wrote Introduction 2 has already shown some engagement with the poems, and as they move through they already know the types of points that they're going to be pulling out. Introduction 3, I think, shows the next level in terms of skill. And as I read it, I'm sure you'll be able to notice why this one is slightly better, and then we'll talk about that once we've read it. There is a clear disparity between an idealized image of love and the harsh realities of real love in the work of both Duffy and Larkin. Larkin's Love Songs in Age considers how the artificial image of an ideal love that is sold through hollow love songs leads the widow to feel disappointed with her experiences. In An Arundel 2, Larkin demonstrates that love is a human construct and, despite its non-existence, humans are desperate to imprint meaning on empty details. Similarly, Duffy's Valentine is an iconoclastic view of how Valentine's Day sells an unobtainable view of love. Finally, Duffy uses Havisham, a character created by Charles Dickens in the 1860s, as a persona to demonstrate how the obsession with love can lead to extraordinary pain. Now, whilst this introduction uses much more sophisticated language, I'm sure you noticed that as we did so, it actually does much more impressive things too. If you look at their first statement, I think this is a much stronger thesis statement. Their argument is very clearly going to be talking about the difference between the ideal image that we're all sold and the harsh reality of what love actually feels like. So this student has been able to very clearly identify how both of these poets talk about love. Okay, so I think it's just a much stronger statement, a much stronger thesis statement. This student then moves on to talk about each poem in the same way that Introduction 2 did. So Larkin's Love Songs in Age considers how the artificial image of an ideal love that is sold through. If you look at the way that this student deals with Love Songs in Age, it shows a little bit more of a perceptive understanding of how that poem reveals these aspects of love. This student again shows that there's another poem that does this. So, for example, Larkin demonstrates that love is a human construct and, despite its non-existence, humans are desperate to imprint meaning on empty details, really identifying how this poem reveals something about the theme. The next thing I'd show you is this. It says, similarly, Duffy's Valentine is an iconoclastic view. Again, moving on to the next poem and showing that there's a similarity in the way that Duffy operates in the same way that Larkin does. And then they move on to Havisham. So this student, in a little bit more of an advanced way, better thesis statement, stronger engagement with each of the poems with a much more perceptive viewpoint. But this student again goes through poem by poem, the ones that are going to appear in this essay and the kind of main argument that they're going to be setting forward. But I'll show you one more example because I think this could be a little bit stronger. And that will be by blending some of these poems together and by revealing how both poems, or all four poems, do the same thing. This one very much states out each poem in turn. If you look at the final part, there's also a little bit of AO3 being used at the end of this introduction, a character created by Charles Dickens in the 1860s. So this student does engage with the fact that Havisham is already based on somebody who exists in literature. Not literally exists, but figuratively exists. That context doesn't really do much here. That context isn't essential to know for this essay. So there's a little bit of AO3 in there, but I don't think it's done particularly well. In this next introduction, you'll be able to see how context could be sprinkled into the introduction if you so chose, and how that can look in a better introduction. So whilst Introduction 3 is a very good introduction, I think there are some elements that could be strengthened further. Introduction 4 is the last introduction that we'll have a look at today. Please don't think that this is the definitive way of completing an introduction. This is simply my guide for you to write a stronger introduction compared to the first introduction that I showed you. Duffy and Larkin can both be seen as critical of love in their anthologies. They explore how the idealistic image of love is unfairly unobtainable and, instead of adding to the myth of true love, favour an honest depiction, even if it is less perfect. In Larkin's Love Songs in Age and An Arundel Tomb, the concept of love is shown as a human construct born out of desperate loneliness. Similarly, Duffy's iconoclastic Valentine and Havisham consider the effects of not being able to obtain the idealised love so eagerly portrayed through the saccharine Valentine's Day of the 1990s and the female expectations of the 1800s. Now, whilst this introduction is shorter than the previous one, and whilst it probably doesn't use quite the same terminology or quite the same level of depth in some parts, I think this is slightly stronger, because what it doesn't do is rely on a one-by-one approach. It doesn't plod through the poems that are going to be used, it begins to link those poems. I also think the thesis statement shows a little bit more light. Their thesis statement, you'll notice, is a little bit longer in comparison to the ones previously. Duffy and Larkin can both be seen as critical of love in their anthologies. I think that first statement is very, very clear, very, very simple. The second statement, they explore how the idealistic image of love is unfairly unobtainable and, instead of adding to the myth of true love, favour an honest depiction, even if it is less perfect. What this student is able to do is encapsulate all 4 poems within their thesis, because that thesis statement shows that all 4 of the poems that this person has selected all do the same thing, really setting out their stall to get those AO4 connections marks. When the student then moves on to mention which poems they're going to use, they don't just do it in a one-by-one approach, they talk about these poems together. Now, this student shows the 2 Larkin poems first and shows how they connect. In Larkin's Love Songs in Age and An Arundel Tomb, the concept of love is shown as a human construct born out of desperate loneliness. So this student in one sentence is able to shed light briefly, because this is an introduction after all, on 2 poems at once. And I think that shows a little bit of a stronger skill set, because that allows us to hit those AO4 marks. They then use the word similarly, which is brilliant. AO4 is being highlighted. Duffy's iconoclastic Valentine and Havisham consider the effects of not being able to obtain the idealised love so eagerly portrayed through the saccharine Valentine's Day of the 1990s and the female expectations of the 1800s. What this student is able to do is to link those 2 poems together and show how, even though they're from different periods, they're written at the same time or written at a very similar time, but they're showing how love throughout the ages also is presented as one thing, but secretly is something different. And the context used at the end of this introduction, and you don't have to have context in your introduction, but sometimes it'll naturally fall in there, is they actually tell me why that context is important. They mentioned the 1990s because in Valentine's Day, she's challenging those Valentine's Day expectations that people have in that society, but then also challenges the female expectations of the 1800s, where to be a spinster, to be unmarried, was frowned upon. What this student is able to do is identify how these poems work in conjunction with each other. Valentine and Havisham are very different in many ways. This student is able to show how, even though they're talking about slightly different contexts, that the underlying theme is exactly the same underneath. So as you can see, what we need to do is make sure that our introduction needs to be concise. We don't have to use a million words writing our introduction. We should be aiming for a few sentences, 5 or 6 sentences maximum. That should be enough for us to get our point across as to what our essay is going to do. We should avoid statements like, in this essay I am going to. We should try and avoid, if we can, a plodding one-by-one approach. We could probably link these poems together from the very beginning of the introduction. And we should make sure that we are using the type of terminology that we're going to be adopting throughout the essay. However, there is one incredibly large mistake that I'm sure you won't do, but I do need to warn you against. And this is the worst mistake you could possibly make. The number one mistake to try and avoid is beginning your essay with unnecessary context. Every year people spout lots of information about Larkin or Duffy and their lives. That is not needed in your introduction. It's okay to sprinkle your context throughout if it's useful, but please don't give me an enormous background on Duffy and Larkin. You simply won't be rewarded for that. Introductions are supposed to be your way of explaining where your essay is going and your way of arguing your point. You set out your stall and you spend the rest of the essay exploring those ideas that you've mentioned. Please don't start it with unnecessary context. Thank you very much for watching this video. Hopefully you can now see what you need to do when it comes to an introduction for this section B essay, and hopefully you've been able to see some of those pitfalls that students make as they begin writing these types of essays. Have an absolutely wonderful day, and I'll speak to you all next time. The next video that I'll make will be looking at good and bad examples of paragraphs when it comes to a section B essay. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.